All right, so like imagine this, right? You order something online and boom, instead of like weeks, it just shows up in a couple of days. All because there's a shortcut across a whole continent.
Huh.
That's the big idea with Mexico's Interoceanic corridor. It's this massive project that could actually like rival the Panama Canal. We're diving deep into a video about it from mega projects, and trust me, you're going to want to hear all about this.
What's really interesting is that this corridor, it's not just some like brand new thing. It's built on like centuries of attempts, successes, and failures, all of which make the current project even more interesting to look at.
So we're not just talking about like steel and concrete, but
Yeah.
like layers of history on top of it too.
Exactly. This region, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, it's the narrowest point between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans in Mexico. The Spanish crown, they had their eyes on this place back in the 1500s. They saw it as a potential trade route.
Oh, wow.
And then in the early 1800s, you have this brilliant German geographer, Alexander von Humboldt. He'd envisioned a canal there.
Yeah. Wow. Imagine if they had actually built a canal way back then. Global trade would have been totally different.
Oh, yeah, for sure. A real what-if moment in history.
Mm-hmm.
But those early attempts, even with famous people backing them, they always seemed to hit a wall.
What was it about this spot that made it so hard to build on?
Well, Mexican presidents back then, they were inspired by, like, the railway boom that was happening in Europe. They wanted to connect important cities with Veracruz, a major port on the coast. But these projects always seemed to stall, usually because of political instability or just not enough money.
It makes you wonder, like, was this whole corridor idea cursed or something? The video mentioned a guy named Jose de Garay who almost managed to get a canal built using convict labor. What was his story?
He's a perfect example of ambition, meeting reality.
Uh,
Garay's plan was pretty clever. Instead of like one massive canal, he proposed connecting rivers and lakes that were already there, creating this navigable route. He even had convict labor all lined up.
oh, wow.
But in the end, nothing came of it.
And get this, Gary actually sold the canal rights to a British company who then turned around and sold them to Americans. It's like flipping houses, but on an international scale.
Like a real estate deal you wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the Americans, they barely even got started before the Mexican government stepped in, claiming that Garay never had the authority to sell those rights in the first place.
Oh, no.
Decades of legal battles followed, and the whole project just froze.
It's like every time they got close, something happened to mess everything up.
Yeah.
Even the gold rush in California, which would have made a passage like this super valuable, couldn't get things moving.
The mid-1800s were a really chaotic time in Mexico. Wars, revolutions, internal conflicts. It was just not a good time to be building anything.
Yeah.
It wasn't until the late 1800s when things started to calm down that there was a real breakthrough. And this time, a private English company came in to save the day. Finally, in 1894, they finished the first railway, connecting the ports of Salina Cruz and Coatzacoalcos.
So they finally got it done. People could finally travel across the continent by train.
Yep. The journey took about 10 hours, way faster than going by sea. And you could see the potential right away. Tons of cargo started moving through, including this massive shipment of 11,000 tons of Hawaiian sugar that made its way all the way to New York. Those coastal towns, they boomed. They went from quiet fishing spots to busy trade hubs practically overnight.
So it sounds like a success story. What happened? Why isn't this railway as famous as the Panama Canal?
Well, in 1914, the Panama Canal opened, and it was a big blow to the Mexican railway. It took away a ton of the transoceanic shipping that would have gone through Mexico. And then on top of that, the Mexican Revolution started, which threw the whole region into chaos again. This promising project that was once so busy, it just faded away.
It's like a roller coaster of hope and then disappointment. But wait, there's got to be more to the story, right? The video isn't about some abandoned railway.
You're right, it doesn't end there. Fast forward to 2018, and the project gets revived under President Obrador. And this time, they're not just talking about it, they're actually doing something.
So this is the modern chapter of the Interoceanic corridor. They're not actually trying to bring that old railway back to life, are they?
They are, but with a modern twist.
Right.
They're not just fixing it up, they're making it bigger, with the goal of handling both modern freight trains and high-speed passenger lines. It's a huge job. They're clearing tons of rock, repairing hundreds of bridges, expanding drainage canals. It's the whole shebang.
Wow, they're really going all in, huh? This mega projects video does a great job of showing just how big this project really is. You see these huge machines moving earth, these long stretches of track being laid. It's really impressive. But is it really possible some parts of that railway are decades old?
Yeah, some are in better shape than others.
Yeah.
One important segment, Line K, it's only about 5% complete. But there was a big sign of progress in 2023 when a brand new locomotive, the Tana Tijuana, did a successful test run with cargo to Salina Cruz. This was a big symbolic victory. It marked the first time in over 20 years that cargo had traveled on those tracks.
I bet people were celebrating that day. The video also mentioned that President Obrador himself took a 9-hour train journey on the finished sections of the railway. That's commitment.
He's really invested in this project. He sees these passenger lines as a model for future high-speed rail lines across all of Mexico. He's been looking at how efficient European and Asian railways are for inspiration.
So he's not just thinking about connecting these two oceans, he's thinking about the bigger picture. But the railway is just one part of this whole corridor, right? What else is going
Oh,
on?
it's way more than just tracks to handle all the traffic. They're completely modernizing the port cities of Salina Cruz and Coatzacoalcos. New highways, bigger ports, streamlined customs, massive breakwaters to protect ships, the works. By the time they're done, those two cities are predicted to have the biggest ports in all of Mexico.
That's incredible. What about areas beyond the ports? The mega projects video mentioned something about industrial parks.
Yeah, they're planning to build about 10 of those along the corridor route. They want to attract both local and foreign investment. This is where things get interesting. Think about industries like oil refining manufacturing, maybe even tech companies setting up shop there.
So they're not just moving goods, they're creating entire industries around this corridor. Now I see why people are comparing this to the Panama Canal. This could be a total game changer, couldn't it?
Yeah, it could be, but like any big project, there are some big challenges we need to talk about.
I was just thinking that, yeah, it can't be all sunshine and rainbows, right?
Not exactly. We've been talking about the ambition, the history, the potential for the economy to really take off. But there's another side of this story we need to consider, the people who actually live there, especially the indigenous communities. They're facing some really tough choices right now.
That's a side of things I'm really curious about. The video mentioned there was some opposition to the project. What are people worried about?
A big one is land use. A lot of indigenous groups see this whole project with the industrial parks and all the infrastructure as a threat to their way of life.
I can understand that.
Their connection to the land is really deep, and they're worried about being displaced, damage to the environment, and their cultural practices being disrupted.
Yeah, it's not just about progress and money for them, it's about protecting their heritage.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that indigenous communities are not all the same. There are a lot of different viewpoints within those groups. Some see this project as a chance to benefit economically, and they welcome the opportunities it might bring. Others are really skeptical and feel like their voices aren't being heard.
So it's a complex situation with no easy answers. Have there been any attempts to address these concerns?
There have been, but it's a work in progress. The Mexican government has held some meetings with certain communities, but many feel like they're not being taken seriously enough. There have been protests, blockades, even threats made against workers. Sadly, things escalated when an activist who was critical of the project was found dead under suspicious circumstances.
Wow, that's a terrible reminder that these aren't just abstract debates. There are real-world consequences here. What needs to happen to make sure indigenous communities aren't left behind or worse, harmed by this project?
Transparency is key.
Yeah,
The government needs to be upfront and honest about the possible impacts, good and bad.
right.
And they need to go beyond just meetings. Genuine collaboration is what's needed, where indigenous communities have a real say in how the project is carried out and how any potential harm can be reduced.
It sounds like finding that balance between progress and protecting people's rights is going to be crucial for this whole thing to work.
It really is. And this is where social impact assessments come in. The video talk about those. They go beyond just looking at economic stuff, like how many jobs are created. They look at the bigger picture, the social and cultural impacts. Will people be displaced? How will traditional land use be affected? Are there any health risks? These are tough questions, but we need honest answers.
And those answers need to lead to action, right? It's not enough to just study the problems.
Right. Mitigation plans need to be put into place, and those
Okay.
plans can't just be handed down by the government. Indigenous communities need to be involved in creating them and making them work.
It reminds me of that saying, nothing about us without us. They need to be at the table, not just on the menu.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's not just the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. If the government ignores these concerns, it could lead to more protests, delays, legal battles, maybe even violence. And all of that could derail the whole project.
So getting this right isn't just about doing the right thing. It's about making sure the project succeeds in the long run.
Exactly. And speaking of the long run, we can't ignore the big question looming over all of this. How is this going to affect the Panama Canal?
Yeah, that's the elephant in the room. The canal has been the king of interoceanic shipping for over a century. Can Mexico really compete with that? Is this like David versus Goliath?
A lot of people are wondering about that.
Yeah.
The Panama Canal is a powerhouse, but it does have its weaknesses. The Mega Projects video pointed out some criticisms that have been made recently. One of the big ones is capacity.
You mean like it can't handle all the traffic?
Some experts are saying it's getting close to its limit. Those huge cargo ships we see nowadays, they're pushing the canal's infrastructure to the max. Plus, there have been problems with droughts affecting the water levels, which are essential for the canal's locks to work. All of that means delays and higher costs for shipping companies.
So that's where Mexico sees an opening, a chance to offer a faster, more reliable route.
Exactly. Even though it uses rail transport, the Interoceanic corridor is actually a shorter route for a lot of ships, especially those going between the U.S. and Asia. If Mexico can keep costs down and make sure everything runs smoothly, it could be a very attractive option.
That could really change global trade routes. Imagine those massive container ships, instead of going through the Panama Canal, they're crossing Mexico by rail. That's a huge shift.
It is, and it could have some major geopolitical ripple effects, too.
Yeah.
The U.S. has always seen the Panama Canal as strategically important, but if Mexico becomes a key player in global shipping, that could really change the relationship between the two countries.
Mexico would suddenly have a lot more power on the world stage.
You got it. And we can't forget about China. They've been investing heavily in infrastructure projects all over the world, and they're very interested in Latin America. The Interoceanic corridor could be a way for them to increase their influence in the region, potentially challenging the dominance of the U.S.
So this project is way more than just a shortcut between two oceans. It could change global trade, shift political power, even redraw the map of international relations.
It's a really interesting example of how big infrastructure projects can have really far-reaching consequences, some intended and some unintended. It's like throwing a pebble into a pond and watching the ripples spread out in ways you never imagined.
Speaking of ripples, let's go back to those environmental concerns we talked about earlier. Those ripples can be pretty destructive if we're not careful.
Definitely. The potential benefits of this project are huge, but we can't ignore the potential downsides, especially when it comes to the environment.
What are the biggest risks we should be thinking about?
Well, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec is a biodiversity hotspot. It's home to a huge variety of ecosystems, rainforests, mangroves, wetlands, you name it. And within those ecosystems, you have tons of plant and animal species, many of which are only found in this region. Building railroads, pipelines, and industrial parks can disrupt these habitats, break up ecosystems, and even lead to species going extinct.
And then there's the potential for pollution, right? More ships, more factories, more trucks on the road, that all creates emissions and waste.
Exactly. Air pollution from all the extra traffic and industrial activity is a concern, especially for people who live near the corridor. Then you have the potential for water pollution, runoff from industrial sites, oil spills from ships. All of that could contaminate water sources and harm both people and ecosystems.
It sounds like the Mexican government has a huge responsibility to minimize these risks. What needs to happen to make sure they don't end up causing an environmental disaster?
They need to do thorough environmental impact assessments. And not just going through the motions, but really digging deep and identifying all the potential problems, and then crucially turning those assessments into action. They need to put strict environmental regulations in place and make sure they're actually followed.
So it's not enough to just check boxes. They have to make sure those regulations have teeth.
Exactly. And it's about going beyond just trying to limit damage. They need to be thinking about ways to make this project truly sustainable. The Mega Projects video mentions sustainable development goals. That means finding ways to build this corridor in a way that minimizes the impact on the environment and promotes long-term ecological health.
So instead of just trying to avoid the worst-case scenario, they're aiming for a best-case scenario where economic development and environmental protection go hand in hand.
That's the ideal, and it's not just good for the environment, it's good for business too. Investors are more and more interested in projects that are environmentally and socially responsible. Yeah. If Mexico can present this corridor as a model for sustainable development, it could attract even more investment and boost its reputation on the world stage.
So it's not just about building a railway in some ports, it's about doing it in a way that benefits both people and the planet.
That's the goal, and it brings us back to those social challenges we talked about earlier. It's all connected.
Right, those concerns from indigenous communities, the possibility of people being displaced, the need to make sure the benefits are shared fairly. These are all tied to the environmental aspects, too.
Absolutely. You can't separate environmental